of Rockingham County, Virginia during World War II. A completion of personal recollections and historical documents. He is a leading expert on the Timberville camps, and his being here today is in conjunction with the display about the subject in our country store exhibit. So moving forward, I give you Mr. Gregory Owen.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks everyone for coming out today. This is a great crowd. Let me ask a question first. How many of you have not heard me give a presentation about the POWs? Whoa, that's fantastic. Okay. All right. Because I do have some new information, not so much new about the Timberville camp per se, but what I'm trying to do with this presentation is to put the POW program from World War II into the wider context of what was happening during World War II in the United States and, of course, on the war fronts, because it's imperative to know so that there is a better understanding of just what the German POW program did, not only for this community, but for 500, well, actually a total of 666 communities across the country in 44 states. So, having said that, what I want to do is to, hold on, we're having our little technical problems. Okay, want to provide 3 key presentation points that we need to understand, okay? Number 1, the U.S. encountered an unprecedented crises in 2 areas during World War II: the severe shortages in the civilian labor force and massive numbers of enemy prisoners of war who were captured on the European battlefronts, okay? Now, I say the European battlefronts because we're talking about ultimately we're talking about millions of German prisoners being captured during and after the war, whereas in the Pacific theater, we captured only and brought to the U.S. only 3,915 Japanese prisoners of war. Anyone want to guess why that disparity exists?
Yes, because of their culture, they committed suicide.
No, they did not surrender. Exactly. So, anyway, second point is it was crucial for the U.S. to develop and implement a new and untested program to resolve both the civilian labor shortage problem and the POW captivity problem simultaneously. It was imperative, it was urgent, it needed an immediate resolution. And third, that resolution was met by federal, state, and local government agencies that worked together to create a successful program, okay? We have to set the context of World War II here. World War II, and most people here don't know the numbers these days, but World War II was total war. It was the most significant event of the 20th century. 70 nations were engaged in combat on 3 continents and the world's oceans. 21 to 25 million military deaths worldwide, 50 to 55 million civilian deaths, and in terms of cost to the United States, $4 trillion. The civilian labor crisis in the United States, population in 1943 was 136,739,000. Of that number, 17,867,000 Americans were inducted into the armed services. And you can see here, 11 million were draftees, 6 million were enlistees. After millions of draftees and enlistees were rejected by the Army or by the military for being either physically or mentally unfit, that left a total of 11.2% of the U.S. population that actually served in the armed forces during World War II. Extrapolate that number to today's population, you would have 42 million men and women in uniform. So that puts it into a context that shows how unbelievable these numbers were and what total war meant to the U.S. And because of the number of Americans who went into the military during the war, that helped create a severe civilian labor shortage. But that was not the only reason. The labor crisis was significantly affected by the number of civilians who took jobs in war production, war factories. You see here, 54,500,000 made up the workforce, a civilian workforce in 1940. During the war, 24 million were employed in war production. What does that mean? That means 24 million people left the farms, the fields, the factories, the small local businesses that were not directly involved in war production. So from 54,500,000, subtract 24 million, and then subtract the 11 million who actually served in uniform, you see that the 54,500,000 civilian workforce was reduced by about 35 million, okay? But what did those people do? They built 2 million trucks, 300,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, and 86,000 tanks. Again, we're talking total war. Everything that happened in the U.S. virtually was happening on a war footing. Along comes 1943 in particular, when the U.S. and the Allied forces, they're now in North Africa, and for the first time they are capturing German prisoners of war and Italian prisoners of war in massive numbers. And those numbers continued to increase throughout the war, all the way through the capitulation of Germany. Tens of thousands were captured during each campaign. So again, starting in North Africa, following all the way until victory in Europe. There were never enough Allied resources overseas to hold and care for the prisoners of war that had been captured. We were the storehouse or the arsenal of democracy, but the massive supplies that were going to the war theaters still could not make up all that was necessary to fight the war and handle the captured enemy prisoners of war that had to be taken care of and had to be controlled. So, again, never enough guards, housing, clothing, food, or transportation to move German prisoners around, to keep them out of the way of being repatriated by their own troops. So it was imperative to get those prisoners of war out of the combat areas so they could not be liberated. So the federal government responds, and how do they do that? They were challenged by the fact that there was absolutely no precedence in U.S. history that would be able to be used as a guide on how to handle massive numbers of German POWs. And I say German POWs, the vast majority of POWs were German, a lesser number were Japanese, Italian, okay? But there was an immediate need for a comprehensive program to resolve both of those crises at the same time. Federal government took the lead, and again, it was with the cooperation of federal, state, local agencies that came together and hammered out a policy, a program that was able to resolve the two crises that the U.S. was facing at the same time, to bolster the civilian labor markets, to replace civilian labor with POW labor, and to house, control, clothe, and feed prisoners of war. Now, how did that happen? First of all, what are the agencies that had to get together and work out this massive policy? Well, obviously, the War Department, now known as the Department of Defense, Joint Chiefs of Staff and Joint Planning Staff, Army Service Forces, and the Service Commands. The U.S. was divided up into, I believe, 7 service commands. We were this area was part of the 3rd Service Command of the U.S. Army. The Provost Marshal General's Office, which was the judicial branch of the Army. The Judge Advocate General's Office, Military Police Corps, they were the ones who were going to have to provide the guards to handle and control the POWs, either overseas or here. Then comes the U.S. State Department, U.S. Department of Justice, Department of Agriculture, War Manpower Commission, U.S. Employment Service. You see, all of these administrations had to get together and, again, work out a comprehensive and workable policy that would answer and resolve the problems that the U.S. faced. Now, don't think that it was an easy process at all. We would take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. This would work for a while, then this would work for a while, or something didn't work at all. So there was a constant movement of ideas and policies that went back and forth between all of these federal agencies, and then including state and local agencies, okay? And specifically, locally, it goes down to the USDA Farm Extension Service that was actually run out of Virginia Tech. And every county in Virginia had a county agent or an extension agent. Frederick Holsinger was the agent for this area. And he was fundamental in this process that ultimately led to a POW camp coming to Timberville. So, they developed, through all this cooperation, 3 fundamental principles. Transport all enemy POWs to military prison camps inside the U.S., employ those POWs as an emergency labor force, and significantly adhere to the rules of the Geneva Convention to the letter. Now, why would it be so important to adhere to the Geneva Convention rules in the handling of prisoners of war that we had control of? Anyone? Well, there were tens of thousands of American and British and French POWs held by the Germans. Anything that might happen to POWs in our care, if that news got back to Hitler, then who knows what he might have done, because he was a vicious, he had a vicious outlook on POWs to begin with, okay? And many Allied POWs were killed, although not necessarily as many as what people think if they look at the movies that came out, but the Germans did not and could not take care of their prisoners of war, our people that they were holding, as well as we were able to, okay? So it all comes down to the fact that we wanted to make sure that we didn't give the Germans any reason to take retribution out on the POWs from the Allied countries. That doesn't have anything to do, by the way, with Russia, which was an Allied country. The Germans hated the Russians hated the Germans, and they didn't care who lived or died of their prisoners, and many of them did not survive. So what was the effect of the POW program once it was established under these 3 program principles? Well, take a look. May 1942, there were 32 prisoners of war held in U.S. By 1945, there were 425,871 POWs here in the United States across 44 countries, 44 states of the continental United States, which of course the United States did not have Alaska and Hawaii at the time as states. Now, interestingly enough, 50,000 of those original prisoners were Italians. Now, they were reclassified as internees in 1943. Anyone know why?
Italian surrender.
Yep, exactly. The invasion of Sicily caused Italy to surrender, and Italy then became a co-belligerent against the Germans, and so the Italian POWs officially were no longer POWs. I mean, they were a co-belligerent country, okay, against the Germans. But they weren't free either. They were reclassified as internees. Now, a very important part of that was that as internees, these Italian prisoners, these former Italian prisoners, were paid the salaries that the enlisted men of the U.S. Army were paid. They were put into American uniforms with a big patch that said Italy on it. They could work in war manufacturing endeavors, whereas POWs could not, okay? So internees had a much easier road to hoe than what POWs would have. Anyone hear of Yank magazine, which was a soldier's magazine during World War II? It was highly regarded. It was a magazine that was produced by enlisted men, for enlisted men, and it was a treasured weekly newspaper. Well, one of the regular things in Yank magazine was a comic strip called The Sad Sack. Sad Sack was an American GI, and he was always on the losing end of everything, okay? So this is a fantastic comic that shows Sack runs into a German, knocks him out, takes him to a POW camp, is making fun of him, and the German turns around and says, "To be shipped to the USA." Sack loses again. There's nothing more than anyone wanted from the U.S. than to go home, but the Germans got to go home and he didn't. So, the POW program was developed around a base camp system. There were 115 POW base camps that were established in existing U.S. Army camps, okay? Such as Camp Pickett, Virginia. Camp Pickett, Virginia was a base camp for POWs, and there were typically between 4,000 and 6,000 prisoners of war there inside the camp in their own prison compound. And as the need for POW labor to be funneled out to areas that needed prisoners to work in the farms, fields, factories, 511 regional branch camps were opened. Some of those camps were built on the site of CCC camps, Civilian Conservation Corps camps. Those camps were permanent camps with permanent buildings, and all you had to do was, all the Army had to do was to build an 8-foot barbed wire fence around the CCC camp, put guard towers up, man the camp with guards and machine guns and all of that, and you had a POW camp ready to roll. Other camps were temporary tent camps, and that's what Timberville was, okay, and we'll get to that. But it was from these regional camps that POW labor then was sent out into the communities where labor was needed. Now, how was that process invoked to get a POW camp like Timberville here? It was a long and drawn out process. First thing, the local area business people and farmers and orchardists would have to get together and meet to discuss the civilian labor shortages that they were faced with. And the county agent, in this case Frederick Holsinger, would be invited to the meeting, and they would discuss all of the possibilities of where POW labor might, or I'm sorry, where other civilian labor might come from, but in fact was not available, okay? So based upon the information that the county agent would obtain, he would send a submission to the War Manpower Commission with a certification of need, saying that there were no other sources of civilian labor available to help bring in the harvest, help do the daily farm work, help working at the factories, you know, that had lost so many workers. And so once the War Manpower Commission determined that everything was suitable for the possibility of POW labor being used, a POW branch camp that was requested for a local area would be provided, okay? And so once that happened, the branch camp would be installed and POWs would be brought in. And then ultimately, and this was not from the very beginning of the program, but ultimately each branch camp commander would decide which farmers, which orchardists, which businessman requesting POW labor could actually have it. And they didn't turn down people for no reason at all. You know, mostly it was just because they didn't have enough people, Germans, to go around. So, with the POWs coming here, oh, and by the way, if you remember, one of the key elements of this program was that the U.S. transported all German prisoners from the European theater to the U.S. Well, how did they do that? The U.S. was the arsenal of democracy. Hundreds and thousands of voyages of transport ships headed from the U.S. to the battlefronts, unloaded their cargo, and before the POW program started, they were heading back to the U.S. empty. So, perfect solution, put the prisoners on those empty ships and send them back, which was a good thing, but potentially it could have been a bad thing because the German prisoners who were sent back on these ships, transported to the U.S., they were terrified that their own U-boats were going to sink those transport ships, because the U-boats, you know, the Kriegsmarine had no idea prisoners were on these ships. There was no way they were going to find out. So that was always a possibility, but it never happened, interestingly enough. I'm sorry, did someone have a question? Okay. So, again, by 1945, there were 425,871 prisoners of war here. Well, imagine that number of prisoners being sent to, ultimately, to branch camps all across the country. Well, how did the civilian population take to that? They did not like it at all when they found out that prisoners of war in large numbers were coming. They were afraid that prisoners were going to escape and go on rampaging and pillaging, you know, blowing up factories and everything else. I mean, there was abject fear, and the newspaper reports at the time show that. But ultimately, there was acceptance because they found out that the vast majority of these German prisoners who were out working in their fields and so forth were just like them. Heard someone say, you know, the picture that was the first one up on the screen showed these young men. They look like us, and so once the civilian population saw that prisoners were not a threat to their livelihood or their lives, then they started to accept the fact that they were there in their communities, and ultimately they accepted the fact that the vast majority of POW laborers did a good job and actually saved their crops, saved their orchard harvests and so forth. And so the program did indeed work the way the authorities hoped that it would, and did not create a security nightmare that some feared. Now, there were different schools of thought about the POW laborers. There was the security first mandate, which meant that a large number of guards would have to go out and be wherever these German prisoners were so that they could be controlled. And the fact was that there were never enough military policemen available to do that. So then it became a labor first mandate, which limited POW security. Ultimately, and there are people here who had prisoners working on their farms. They will tell you that the prisoners were not guarded when they were working in most of the local areas. And again, it was only because there were not enough guards to go around. Another issue was POW escapes. There were 2,000, well, I'll get to that shortly. The POW escapes, another issue, NCOs, German non-commissioned officers were placed in charge of POW discipline, and we'll take a look at that. POWs died in captivity here, and then there was the issue of irredeemable Nazi POWs. There were 2,222 escapes of German prisoners who were held in the U.S. One escaped from Timberville. His name was Kurt Krott, and he wasn't trying to get away. I mean, where was he going to go? Okay, but he probably got bored. Some people say that he was trying to meet up with a girl that he had met, a local girl. But the bottom line was he was loose for most of an afternoon and evening and was recaptured and not taken back to the Timberville POW camp, by the way. He was taken back to the base camp, to a prison compound at Camp Pickett. So, of the total number of POWs, again, 2,222 POWs escaped. The vast majority were recaptured in short order. The last German prisoner to give himself up did so in 1985. His name was Georg Gärtner, and this is his FBI most wanted poster. And he escaped from a POW camp in New Mexico, made his way down to Mexico, then made his way to Hawaii, had a thriving building business in Hawaii, moved to California, became a ski instructor and a semi-pro tennis player, and ultimately got married, okay, and then sort of disappeared into the fabric of society until he wound up living in Chicago. And there was, I'm trying to remember exactly how it was, his wife had no idea that he was an escaped German POW. And they had been married like 35 years. And anyway, she found out, and it caused a rift between the two, and she ultimately divorced him, by the way. And Georg Gärtner decided to come in from the cold. So he did so in a typical American way. He gave himself up to Bryant Gumbel on the Today Show and was turned over then to the U.S. authorities. So here's the question. What did the authorities do with him? He was an escaped prisoner of war on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. What happened to him? How did the government deal with him?
We weren't at war with Germany anymore, so could they really do anything?
The Geneva Convention of 1929 says that is the duty of a prisoner of war to try to escape. Well, he did. He didn't commit any crime. So authorities said, yep, you're Georg Gertner, you're the guy we've been looking for, you're free to go. So, yeah, and he lived out the rest of his life in Chicago, divorced. So, anyway. There were 491 POW deaths. And you'll see here, there were 7 murders committed by POWs that are known to have been murders. There were 40 who were shot during escapes or were murdered by Americans, some civilians, some military people, plain murder. 72 suicides. Now, those 72 suicides probably is inaccurate. Most of them probably were murdered by their own men, because it was thought, or it was discovered, that some of those 72 were talking in defeatist terms and were saying Germany was going to lose the war and so forth. And remember, German non-commissioned officers were actually put in charge of controlling the enlisted POWs in the American camps. Okay, bad decision. And the Americans, thought, the Army thought, well, best way to control German enlisted men was have a German NCO, a sergeant, be in control of them. Well, a lot of those NCOs were Nazis, okay? And so that created a lot of animosity and indeed murders and suicides. 93 died in accidents and vehicle crashes. 265 from natural causes. Most of those had illnesses that they had contracted before they were even shipped over to the U.S. 14 of the German prisoners who were known and convicted for having murdered their own men were then executed after the war by the Army. Okay, the U.S. was not going to execute any German POWs in their control before the war ended. Die-hard Nazis, again, too many of them were in charge of of German enlisted men, and the Geneva Convention of 1929 forbade the separation or segregation of German POWs by rank, except for officers. Officers were in a different camp all the time. Enlisted men were in a different camp all the time, okay? But the bottom line was, ultimately there were 5,000 irredeemable Nazis who weren't worth putting out into the fields or anything, because they were not going to be good workers. So they were shipped to a camp in Alva, Oklahoma. And a friend of mine's from Oklahoma, and he knows about Alva, and that is the perfect place for 5,000 irredeemable Nazis to be sent. They just sat there and did nothing. They were not used as POW labor at all. Okay, so let's drill down, as the industrial term is, and talk about the POW program at the micro level, and that is the Shenandoah Valley, Central Shenandoah Valley. There are 35 base camps and branch camps in Virginia, 4 of them in the Shenandoah Valley. Now, I need to actually parse this a little bit. Ingleside Hotel and Shinville Hotel in Newmarket were not POW camps. They were internment camps, okay, for German and Italian diplomats, okay? Diplomats were never POWs. They were not forced to work or do anything other than reside as internees under control of the U.S. State Department. Now, remember, Germany and Japan had our diplomats who were stationed in their countries as internees also. So the State Department wanted, again, to do everything possible not to endanger those diplomats' lives by forcing the diplomats here to do anything, okay, or to live in bad conditions. So, talking about bad conditions, or not bad conditions, the Ingleside Hotel, Shinville Hotel. The Greenbrier was also a diplomat's internment camp, as was the Homestead. Okay, so the story about Shinville Hotel is really interesting. Italian and German diplomats were together initially at the Ingleside in Stanton, and then in 1943, when Italy surrendered to the Allies and became a co-belligerent against Germany, it was decided by the State Department, better separate those diplomats. So they took all the Italian diplomats, and there were 19 of them, and took them to the Shinville Hotel in Newmarket. And the way it worked was this: Charlotte Miller was the owner of the Shinville. She was standing behind her counter, and a guy with a nice suit came in, flashed his badge, and said, "We're from the U.S. State Department. We're taking over your hotel." And they then brought the Italian diplomats in, and according to all eyewitnesses, some of these Italian diplomats were young and extraordinarily good-looking men, and the women of Newmarket went crazy. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I talked to, I gave a presentation at Newmarket some years ago, and this one World War II veteran was still salty about the fact that the local girls were making eyes at all these Italian diplomats while he and his other fellow GIs were fighting overseas, and actually interviewed, when I started the research on this project, a guy who, as a 14-year-old, worked at the Shinville golf course, and he said, "I could not define fraternization for you, but I sure knew it when I saw it on the back nine of the golf course." The explanation to that is that the diplomats had run of the hotel. They played golf, they played tennis, they could go downtown with guards, okay? Probably not because the diplomats were going to escape or anything. They had to be guarded, for any possibility that civilians might do something to them. But yeah, they really caused a ruckus in Newmarket. So that left two other locations in this area actually were POW camps: Timberville in Rockingham County here, and Camp Lyndhurst in Augusta County. Now, we talked about the fact that the civilian employers, farmers, orchardists, had to try to find replacement labor for the people that they had lost who had gone into the war production factories or into the military. So where did they go looking for people? Well, you see here, men not accepted for military service, conscientious objectors, members of the Women's Land Army. Anybody hear of the Women's Land Army? They were usually college students who were in this organization that was founded initially in Britain, and these co-eds went out into the fields and helped bring in the harvest and everything. But there were only a limited number of women who were in the Women's Land Army. So they would the government came up with a Victory Farm Boys and Girls program. They used Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, local high school and college students given time off, federal employees, state prison convicts, and there still was not enough labor. So again, the reason for bringing the POWs here in Rockingham County was to supplement the labor force shortages. So here's Camp Timberville. On Herman Holler's farm. What's the road number? I always forget it. 683?
681, I think.
681, okay. Beyond Showalter's orchard, okay? And you'll see here, this is a tent camp. It was installed in the summer of 1944 and worked here, the POWs worked here for 3 months and then were sent back to Camp Pickett. The camp was taken down, and then in the harvest season of 1945, they came back for 3 months, took in the harvest, and then were sent back to Camp Pickett. But you can see here is the guard tower, and guard tower there, the fence that goes around the POW compound. On this side of the fence, those tents are all of the tents that the American GIs who were in control of those POWs, where they lived, and that was in accordance strictly with the Geneva Convention of 1929 that said that the prisoners of war of any country had to be cared for with the same level of food, clothing, and shelter that the captive forces employed. So in camps where there were permanent buildings that the American troops would be in, the POWs had permanent buildings. In the case of Timberville, the tent camp, being a necessity, caused the Americans also to be housed in a tent camp. And it was very strictly controlled, by the way. So, at this point, I want to tell you that in the summer of 1944, okay, two young boys, Ben and Joe May, watched as these people started building the tent camp. They would go every morning to the top of this hill after their dad had told them, "You boys stay away from there. Those men are dangerous." Isn't that right, Ben? Ben May here. And they watched as the POWs built the camp, and then ultimately, at the end of August, a convoy of army trucks drove through Timberville. Everybody, according to different sources, everybody in town came out onto their front porches and were watching, you know, these trucks going by full of German prisoners, these army trucks. And one of the POWs, hold on a second, I can't remember his name offhand. She told me that they noticed the people, you know, watching intently, and he said to his buddy, "They're trying to see if we have horns." The German was vilified, as you might imagine, you know, these vicious Nazis. They were so vilified that people thought, you know, they were just going to be these terrible people. As a matter of fact, Ben said he was disappointed when he saw the German prisoners for the first time. He thought they were going to be monsters, and they turned out to be 16-year-old kids. Ben, do you want to say anything else about that?
No, right, that hill on the left side is where my brother and I would watch everything that was going on, and we were hoping some action would take place. It never happened at one time, and that was inner camp discipline. A guy had stolen something while he was helping on the farms, and they disciplined him. They beat him pretty badly. But and you had asked me about the Geneva Convention. Well,
yeah,
we didn't know anything about that,
sure.
but we did see it. So
yeah.
you
So the Americans,
went to
the
Germany
American
and met the guy that was at this camp, and he said yes, they did have their own chain of command inside the camp.
Yeah. So, this is the only photograph, and by the way, Ben gave me this photograph. This is the only photograph that I've ever been able to find of the camp. And I have contacted people who appeared to be the very officers in charge of the camp. Found one guy up in New York State and said, were you assigned to a POW camp in Virginia? Yes. Your name is so forth and so on? Yes. And I asked him, I said, so the camp was Timberville, right? He said, I don't think so. But it had to be. His memory was leaving him, unfortunately. But in any regard, Timberville's POW camp was an essential part of the food production program that was undertaken in the Plains District of Rockingham County during World War II. this area, believe it or not, was critically important to the production of poultry, food, fruit and vegetables. And in 1944, summer of 1944, you see 350 train cars of canned products were shipped out of Timberville, 280 train cars in 1945. POWs performed 30,375 man days of labor during those 2-3 month harvest seasons. Average POW population, 175. It varied depending upon needs. If they needed more POWs and they were available from Camp Pickett, they would bring more in. If they, and presumably if they didn't have a need for 175 and only 150, they would ship 25 back, because they were not going to have POWs just, lying around not doing anything. So they were primarily engaged in farm, orchard, and factory labor. The daily labor rate in Rockingham County during World War II was $2.85. That's what a civilian earned on average in Rockingham County during World War II, okay? So what that means is, this is the way it worked. The employers, be they farmers or businessmen, whoever they were, who got POWs to work for them, they paid the Army $2.85 a day per prisoner, okay? Of that $2.85 a day, 85 cents was saved for the prisoner himself. And that 85 cents a day then accumulated and was accounted for, and they were issued canteen scrip, not U.S. cash. They didn't want anybody escaping with U.S. currency. But with the canteen scrip, they could buy candy bars, razor blades, stuff like that, to make their lives a little bit better. Any money that they had not spent at the time that they were repatriated back to Germany was paid to them by check by the Army. And so hundreds of thousands of former POWs repatriated back to Germany were able to live on the devastated German economy solely because they had money that they could turn in for occupation currency once they got back to Germany. And by the way, I've gotten a lot of questions. People will say, well, how many POWs stayed here after the war? Well, the answer is none, except for 17 who, at the time that all the POWs were repatriated back, had escaped and had not been found yet, including Georg Gertner, we talked about it. But the prisoners all were required to be sent back. Now, another question that comes up is, well, how many of them came back? There's no hard and fast number, but it's estimated that about 5,000 former German POWs came back to the U.S. to set up housekeeping. And they were only allowed to do so beginning in 1951. They had to apply for immigration status through the U.S. State Department, okay? They could not just stay here, or they couldn't just decide in 1947, hey, I'm going back to where I was held as POW. Didn't happen. Here are the local employers of POW labor. Ziegler Cannery, Rockingham Poultry, Mutual Cold Storage, H.E. Mason Sawmill. In Harrisonburg, Rocco, City Produce Exchange, Tip Top Fruit Farm, and Harrisonburg Junk and Hide. Interesting, the Harrisonburg Junk and Hide was owned by a Jewish guy named Joe Kimmel. And I'm trying to imagine how many Germans would he have had working in his junkyard. Now here's interesting little aside. How did the POWs get from Timberville to Harrisonburg? Well, they were put on a bus and came up to the Harrisonburg bus station every morning. And then at the end of the day, taken back. to Timberville. And this is the way it worked also. Remember, we said that POWs were not guarded, so when Ben's dad had prisoners on his farm, did your dad have a truck or a car?
Flatbed pickup truck. and
Okay, he
hauled them back.
would go to the POW camp, pick up his allotment of prisoners, drive them back. He was responsible for taking care of those prisoners during the day and bringing them back in the evening. Okay, again, not guarded. Yes,
When these prisoners were farmed out, so to speak, to work on farms,
yeah.
did the farmer's wife have to feed them lunch?
No, here's the thing about it. They were given rations, okay, that they took with them to their places of work. But, remember we said acceptance and fraternization? In short order, it was discovered that the prisoners discovered, well, if I do a good job, my employer's gonna be nice to me, and so I might benefit from that. And the employer, be it farmer, orchardist, whatever, he's decided, if I treat these prisoners well, they'll do a better job. And ultimately, almost, well, I won't say in every case, but in many cases, the farm wife would fix lunch and the Germans would share it. And as a matter of fact, the German POW from Augusta County, about whom I wrote, he ate his meals oftentimes in the family kitchen. Absolutely against the rules. If he would have been found out, he would have been in great trouble, and the farmer who employed him would never have gotten any prisoners. But yes, now, I wish I could remember the name of a local farm family who had lost a son killed by the Germans in battle, and they had POWs on the farm, and that deceased GI's mother fixed meals for the German POWs that worked on their farm, and she said it was the hardest thing she ever had to do at the beginning, to fix meals, but they decided as a family they were going to do that. Imagine. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I cannot remember the name of the person, but yeah. Yes.
Well, the people that settled the valley were Germans, so was there
Absolutely.
any kind of connection between the prisoners of war and the people that had settled here?
In keeping with the idea that, these people are so much like us, it helped, I think, but remember also that a huge contingent of American soldiers fighting in Germany had German names. And in fact, a lot of those people had relatives in Germany that they could easily have been fighting. When I went to the German cemetery at Le Camp in Normandy, the first person, or the first gravestone I came to was a Meyerhofer. Yeah. And talking about the connection of German POWs and Americans, any number of POWs had relatives living in the U.S. And there's a picture that I have, it's not in the program, but there is a picture of a German POW sitting at his camp in their little club room, or whatever you want to call it, meeting with his two sisters who had come to the camp to visit him. Yes?
Was there any POWs that stayed in the valley after they were released from the camp?
They had to go back to Germany, and then in 1951 they could come back, and I'm aware of 3 who came back. Yeah.
Did you ever interview Hans Chagas?
Hans Chagas was not willing to be interviewed.
Really?
As a matter of fact, Hans' wife answered the phone when I called to speak to him, and she said he doesn't want to be interviewed, but I'm going to give you the name of another former prisoner who was at Camp Lyndhurst. His name is Carl Baumann. he will talk to you, and did he ever? And this is the book that came out of that association. Yes, yeah, I'd love to have talked to Hans. Yeah, okay. Speaking of Camp Lyndhurst, this is POW Camp Lyndhurst. It is a former CCC camp. You can see the huge difference between the Timberville camp and Camp Lyndhurst. Permanent buildings, and all the Army had to do was throw up a fence around it and put in guard towers, and they were good to go. Here is my plat map of what the camp looked like, based upon doing a lot of work up at the POW campsite and trying to find all of these different locations. And the camp is totally today overgrown, and there's still indications that a POW camp or a CCC camp was there, but it is so easy to get lost in that area. You know, the main area of the lawn is indistinguishable from the rest of the woods, and this is the key street right here. You can't even see it anymore, and it took a lot of effort to come up with this plat map. By the way, in 2014, a documentary film was produced by James Overton called the Camp Lyndhurst Saga, about my research at the Lyndhurst POW camp, and you can see what we're dealing with. If you look, you can go to YouTube and find that. Again, it's the Camp Lyndhurst Saga. I'm sorry, in this land, the Camp Lyndhurst Saga. So anyway, you can see how established Lyndhurst was by comparison to Timberville.
How were they employed?
I'm sorry?
How were the people in Lyndhurst employed?
Okay. Mainly on farms, okay? The only large employer at using POWs was Woodrow Wilson Army Hospital, okay? The vast majority of the 250 were put on farms and in orchards, and a large number in timber cutting, pulpwood cutting. That was a big deal in Augusta County. So, and just to put things in perspective, you see here that during World War II, there were 17,000 acres of apple trees in Augusta County. And 1944, they produced 440,000, or the 440,000 apple trees produced a 2 million bushel apple harvest. Those apples were, that harvest was going to essentially be lost if they couldn't pull in enough people, volunteers, and ultimately POWs to bring that harvest in. And they did so. The POWs performed 43,000 man days of labor. And you see here, this camp was open 17 months straight, okay? They stayed, they were not taken back after the harvest season each year, but they actually stayed in Camp Lyndhurst. POW daily labor rate in Augusta County at the time was $3.50. Remember, back in that time, Stanton was the queen city of the Shenandoah Valley, not Harrisonburg. Okay, so their hourly labor rate was higher than what Rockingham County's was. Yes?
How could the farmers who had the orchards communicate with these prisoners and tell them what to do?
That is a great question. Some of the employers, some of the farmers were of German heritage, and some knew a little German. But in the case of Carl Baumann and his employer, whose name was Galen Heatwell, they just started off with very basic words, and were able, using hand motions to communicate, what was needed or to be done, and so forth. Yeah, and Carl himself was, I found, was an extremely intelligent man. He taught himself English while he was on Galen Peebles' farm. And so, yeah, he stood out from most other POWs, as a matter of fact. So, what is the final accounting for the POWs being brought here to the United States as a labor force? Well, you can see in May 1945, 91.3% of all POWs in the U.S. were actually employed as a labor force. And even at that, it was impossible to fill all the requests for POW labor. The POWs bringing in the 1944 harvest in Augusta County, they did such a good job that the farmers and employers in Augusta County asked the county agent if they could be held over for another year to help bring in the 1945 harvest. But bottom line was that by February of 1946, most of the POWs had been repatriated back to Europe. And a number of those POWs actually were not released. They first were sent to France. That's where they embarked from the ships from the US, and the French and the Brits were there to meet them on the docks, and they took a bunch of prisoners and put them to work for years to help rebuild the damage in London, for example, and the other British cities that had been bombed, and especially the French to help rebuild France. So a lot of these guys who were in the US could not go home until about 1948. But that's not as bad as a lot of the German POWs held by the Russians. They didn't get back until 1955 in many cases.
10 years.
Yeah, yeah, those who lived. Yeah, so you can see here, POWs as the end in the end result provided 851,994 man-months of labor, and the vast majority in agricultural work, as you can see.
Well, what do you do in public works?
The public works were helping to build roads or to clean out the ditches and so forth. Yeah. So, the success of the POW program far outweighed the security risk taken to provide that POW labor. Again, the fears that the civilian population had did not come to be an issue at all. It turned out, all in all, to be an extremely well maintained and well-maintained program that did what it was supposed to do. It helped alleviate the civilian labor shortage, and it successfully confined 425,000 plus prisoners of war. And those POWs who worked were paid $274,771,000, again, that they took back with them, at least in part, that they were able to live off of. And what we have to realize here also is, and according to Karl Baumann, Germany was absolutely devastated at the end of the war. And the main goal for many Germans at the end of the war was walking from village to village or location to location just to try to find something to eat, okay? And Karl's family had to eat the family dog. That's how desperate the situation in Germany was. It was totally devastating, okay? So, that is the essence of the program. Now, if you want to read more about the POW camp here and read interviews that I did with Ben and with other local people, this is the museum's copy of Wehrmacht Autumns. It is also available at the Massanutten Regional Library and the Library of Virginia. And it has a lot of details, including what I think is very interesting, Daily News Record and Shenandoah, what was the name of the Shenandoah?
Shenandoah Herald?
Yeah, Shenandoah Herald
Valley.
newspaper. Every article about POWs that was in either of those newspapers, they're in here, okay? And then finally, again, my book, The Longest Patrol U-Boat Gunners War. I don't have an inventory of my own. You can get this through Amazon.com, and this is the detailed wartime experience of Carl Baumann. And actually, it also covers him being repatriated back to Germany and living through the devastation of what he found when he got back home. And Carl was just an extraordinary person to work with. I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours with Carl and his wife, Annalisa, and they became good friends. So how did that happen? Well, in 1951, Carl and his wife came to the U.S., immigrated from the Dortmund area of Germany, set up housekeeping 10 miles from Camp Lyndhurst, and remained here the rest of their lives. Raised a family of educators, and his story is really great. Yes?
Gregory, wasn't he sponsored by the farmer who
Yes.
he actually worked for? To get
Absolutely.
him back here, it cost him $3,000 to get him here.
Yeah. That was a key element of people coming back, if they had a sponsor,
Right.
to help pay the bills for them to come by ship back to the U.S. And so Carl and Annalisa were sponsored by Galen Heatwell and his family, and they employed Carl on the farm until Carl was able ultimately to get a job with ASR, American Safety Razor, as a machine tool builder, and he spent a career there as a highly skilled technician. And again, his memory was incredible, but it wasn't perfect. So what I do, he was a U-boat crewman, by the way. What I use as the chronological basis for the story is his U-boat's actual daily war diary that says what his U-boat was doing every day they were on patrols, and his involvement and everything. He was severely wounded, by the way, aboard his submarine, and was captured as a result of that by the Americans in the city of Brest in a German naval hospital after that city had been taken under siege and caused the Germans to surrender. But his observations are really interesting. So it was an absolute pleasure to know Carl and to work with him. So, yes.
What do you know about the dances?
About what?
The dances that
Oh,
they-
well, the USO, local USO was held at a garage. What was the name of the garage?
Gordon's right
Gordon's
down the
Garage,
street.
yeah. I thought it was Gordon's, but there was a Gordon's Garage in Bridgewater, and I didn't want to say it if it was wrong. Yeah, the USO was a local entity that provided rest and recreation for the American GIs who were at Camp Timberville. And
You mean the German?
oh, well, the Germans didn't have any.
Well, yes, the local girls were invited to the dances with the German men.
The youth fellowships of the three churches were involved.
That sounds vaguely familiar,
We
but
have a
Tippett,
resident in Timberville
is that right?
who
Okay.
actually attended those
Oh, wow.
dances
Okay.
as a young girl.
Okay, it wasn't common though.
What's that?
I don't think it was common where they did that, and it would have only occurred after the war was over. Okay, but remember, the POWs were
Well,
only
her
here.
boyfriend at the time was stationed in Germany or overseas in
Uh-huh.
the war, so I think the war was still going on when this happened, because he wasn't too happy about when he heard that she had.
They
Interesting.
were only here 2 years.
They were here 3
each
months
time.
in 44 and 3 months in 45.
That's right, that's only
Yeah.
over a 6-month
Oh,
period.
really?
Yeah.
So it had to be doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, in August of 1945, no, the war was over at that point.
We
Germans
also
surrendered
had
on May
them-
7th.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We also had them out to the Gordon's backyard.
Is that
for
right?
Picnics. Yes.
Oh,
And it was a free church fellowship, few fellowship.
Is that right? Would you all mind to write down what you know about that? Because I want to include that in my research material, because that's something that I had not heard, or if I had, I have forgotten. But yeah, I'm very interested to have that so I can put that into my research documentation. Yeah. Now, the prisoners were sometimes taken to the Lutheran chapel on the other side of Ben's farm for Sunday services, and they in fact had an altar that they built that is at the Lutheran chapel right now.
St.
Yes.
John, St. John.
St. John's.
Yeah.
Me and my grandmother go to that.
Do you? Okay. Well, did you know what the story about the altar was?
Yes, so they made some of the pews too, actually. They made the altar and some of the pews.
Wow. Thank you. That's wonderful. Any other questions?
Sometimes.
But if not, thank you so much for your kind attention. And if there's anything else that
Before you rush out, let me just thank you for coming to celebrate our 26th year here and take home some cookies to remind